Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this section. This section is on what we call factor by grouping. Okay, and I know there's a lot of words on here, but I just want to take a moment to look at something. So, and it's right here. So I'm just going to highlight this for a second, okay? So now what happens if I gave you, back in the last unit, if I said, hey guys, so here's a plus b and x plus y. Can you multiply this out for me? Well, hopefully you would say yes. And I cannot draw a box if my life depended on it right now, but that's okay. You get the idea. So a plus b and x plus y, right? You would get ax and you get bx, and then you would get ay and by, right? And what you'll notice is that then I would get ax plus bx plus ay plus by, right? And now factor by grouping, what it essentially does is it groups two terms together. So really what you end up doing is you end up starting off with this term. So you start off with this term, and then I'm like, oh, I wonder what I can do, just because I can. And what we do is we do what we call factor by grouping. So I group typically the first two, and then I group typically the last two. And I try to factor out the greatest common factor. So what do they have in common? Well, they both, in this first parentheses, have an x in common. So I'm left with an a plus b. And then in my second parentheses, I have a y in common. And then I have an a plus b. And what you're like, wow, there's a lot of a plus b's in there. Well, I have a first term, and then I have a second term. Well, what do those two terms have in common? They have an a plus b in common. And what am I left with, right? So what do I have in common? I have an a, oops, I probably should have used a highlighter. I have an a plus b that's in common, right? And what am I left with? I'm left with an x and a y. And I'm left with a plus sign. You know, just like what we did in the last section with greatest common factor. So I'm left with an x plus y. And then this is what we call my factored form, okay? So anytime I have a situation like this, what I'm going to try to do is group them. That's step one. Factor out a GCF, which is down here. Factor out a GCF. And then factor out, again, another round of GCF, okay? So that is what we are looking at. I'm just going to erase this so it doesn't clutter up our directions here. Okay, so if I look at example 1, right? So let's change back my colors. I think we're supposed to be purple. Yeah, we're supposed to be purple. Okay, so I'm going to group my first two terms and group my second two terms. So what is in common between the first two terms, right? So what do I have in common? I have a u in common, I have a u in common, and then remember that my 6 breaks down to 2 times 3. So I also have a 2 in common. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to factor out a 2u out of my first parentheses. And what am I left with? I'm left with a 3 and a v. So then I'm left with v plus 3, okay? Then I have a plus sign. And now what I have is 15 is the same thing as 3 times 5. So when I look at what's in common in my last two terms, I have a 5 that's in common, and then that's it. So all I'm left with is a v and a plus 3, right? So I'm going to factor out a 5, and I'm left with a v plus 3. Now I have two terms here, which I'm going to change the color here. So I've got two terms, a first term and a second term, right? So what do those two terms have in common? I have a common v plus 3. And what am I left with? A 2u, a positive sign, and a 5. So I'm going to factor out a v plus 3, and I'm left with a 2u plus 5. And that is my fully factored form. Okay? Again, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to factor again. So I look at my first two terms and my second two terms. Okay? And so what do I have in common? This is 2 times 5, right? And then this is 2 times 10 and 2 times 5. So what do I have in common? I have in common my first one, I have a t that's in common. And then I don't have anybody else in common. So I don't have the 10, nor do I have the w. So I can factor out a t, and I'm left with w plus 10. And then in my second parentheses, they both have a negative here. I like to make my variables in my parentheses next, on the left-hand side of the parentheses. I like to always make them positive. So I'm going to say that I have a negative in common and I have a 2 in common, and that's basically it. Everything else, I don't have a 10 and I don't have a w in common. So what's going to happen is I'm going to factor out a negative 2, and then that's going to make me a positive w. And then because of this negative sign that's right here, it is going to make a positive 10. Okay, and then what's in common between my two terms here is a w plus 10, and then I'm left with a 2, a negative sign, and a t. So my w plus 10 comes out, and I'm left with t minus 2 on the inside. And that is my fully factored form, okay? So again, I'm going to group my first two terms, group my last two terms. What's in common? So remember, 21 is 3 times 7. So what's in common here is a 3, an m, and then what it's not in common is 7, a negative sign, and p. So I have a 3m in common, 7 minus p. And then now, what's in common here? So I could break this down into prime factors, but I also know that 4 times 7 is 28. So what I actually have in common, little shortcut, and it's okay for a future class if you do this shortcut, is that I could pull out the composite number instead. And so that gives me with a plus 4, and then I have p minus 7. Now, what you notice is that what's a little strange is that I have a 7 minus p and a p minus 7, which are basically the same thing, except well, one of them, I have to factor out a negative. So if I made a negative 3m here, just like we've done in a previous section, that would turn around my variable. So that would make a positive p and a negative 7 here. So 4p minus 7. And now what we can talk about is what's in common between my two terms, because now I do have something that's actually in common. Now I have a p minus 7 that's in common, and then what I have left over is a negative 3m plus 4. So I have a p minus 7 that comes out, and a negative 3m plus 4 that stays on the inside. Okay, and then that is my solution here. Okay, and then example 4 is the last one that we have. So then I'm going to group my first two terms, group my last two terms together. Remember that 33 is the same thing as 3 times 11. So what I have in common is a 3. And I'm going to pull out a negative 3. And then I have a 3 in common, and I have an x squared. And my x cubed is really x squared times x. So I have an x squared in common. Okay, so really I have a negative 3x squared in common. I'm left with an x plus, nope, x minus, just kidding, x minus 11. And then remember that 44 is the same thing as 4 times 11. So I could have broken down by prime numbers, or I could just recognize that I have a 4 here and a 4 here, and then what I'm left with is an x minus 11. So I pull out a positive 4, and I'm left with x minus 11. So now we can start talking about what's in common between these two terms, here and here. I didn't highlight very well. And then what I have in common is an x minus 11, and I'm left with a 4, a plus sign, and a negative 3x squared. So I have an x minus 11 and a negative 3x squared plus 4. Okay? And that is it for this lesson.